Adjectives of order. That summer, she had a student who was obsessed with the order of adjectives. A soldier in the South Vietnamese army, he had been taken prisoner when Saigon fell. He wanted to know why the order could not be altered. The sweltering city streets shook with rockets and helicopters, the city's sweltering streets. On the dusty brown field of the chalkboard, she wrote, "The mother took warm homemade bread from the oven. City is essential to streets, as homemade is essential to bread." He copied this down, but he wanted to know if his brothers were lost before older, if he worked security at a 20-story modern downtown bank or downtown 20-story modern. When he first arrived, he did not know enough English to order a sandwich. He asked her to explain each part of lovely, big, rectangular, old, red, English, Catholic leather Bible. Evaluation before size, age before color, nationality before religion, time before length. Adding and, one could determine if two adjectives were equal. After Saigon fell, he had survived 9 long years of torture. 9 and long. He knew no other way to say this. I think part of the reason that I have traveled a lot and lived different places in my life and have this sort of obsession with geography and its mortal natures is that my mother found herself living in Fort Worth, Texas, which is where I was born, and really disliked Fort Worth and wanted to get out. And so anytime she could, she would take us on the longest road trips up to Canada and things. We would just drive forever. And so this poem makes reference to being in the car with her, and also makes reference to her being a piano teacher, which is what she did when I was very young. And before I had a sense of how long time was, like how long 30 minutes was, I knew how long a piano lesson was because I would always wait for her to finish the lessons. So she would tell me when I would say, "Are we there yet?" She would say, "1 piano lesson more," or 2 piano lessons more. So there's a reference to that. And this is a sestina, so for those of you who are familiar with that form, or if you're not, it's a highly repetitive form, so you may notice the same words reappearing at the ends of lines. Measures. When my mother hated me, she left and drove. Once, with a blizzard blowing in, she won 2 tickets to the symphony. She'd stopped a mile away and called the radio to name a piece by Liszt. She recognized returning as an art practiced by leaving. She played the piano rarely, said she'd never played with grace, so taught instead. Her students drove for miles carrying folded music, returning years later with stories of scholarships they'd won, and those who can't do teach. I learned the name of every note, the sharps and flats, but stopped just short of music. Started over, stopped again at 13, claiming Bon Jovi played better than Van Cliburn. I'd learned to name distance with music, although I only drove my mother to smile, the fight already won by age. I would grow up. She'd keep returning from leaving like a fugue's anger returning to conscious quiet. One summer night she stopped and bought 2 pints of ice cream. Vanilla won against staying gone, she said, as if she'd played both hands. She never did say where she drove. We knew the world inside was too vast to name, so fled it. Before I could tell time, she'd name an hour, 2 piano lessons, turning all distance into sound. My mother drove a lesson more before we stopped. My role was waiting while the time was played in treble fields and roads until sleep won. Stretched out across the back seat that I'd won by default as the only child, I'd name the constellations silently replayed outside the glass each night, as if returning were recital for a better leaving. I learned its movements while my mother drove. She and I never won the game that drove us, never dared to name the song that really stopped us, how our hearts played Allegro con spiritu, returning. Heartlines. Listen to your heart, this new man tells me. We are in a bar with red velvet curtains for walls, sashes of conversation draped under music. He pours rum and then Coke over ice, which rattles like elegant gravel. When I listen to my heart, I hear tires crunching on a dirt road years out of this city, thrum pulse of wood slats on the high-water bridge. I swam after angelfish in that shallow creek, and though I'm sure now they were trout or less, I remember their fins flirtatious silver. Why is it that blood, which is most of our bodies, disappears when we strike it with light? If I could, I'd spend this night in my own heart, hear its off-metronome gurgle, flowing and falling of darkness. I'd string bright lure, open and fill the locks. In there, my father's fibrillated beat, my mother's paling blood. In the red-lit elevator, he jokes clever drunkenly of Dante, though next day, riding down 9 floors in silence, I do not think of hell but of a heart, awkwardly standing in a single chamber as the cables lower us into our outside skins. I never see this man again, a classical pianist stockbroker who promised to seduce me with music. I remember these notes, like the 75 counties of a state I seldom visit, useless even when I learned them as a child, unforgettably by heart. I always ask how many people in the audience had to memorize all of their counties to some sing-song rhythm. Did you have to do that in school?
Ashley,
Baxter, Ben, Boone, Bradley, Calhoun, Carrick.
Sorry. Nerd moment.
This is too fantastic because I always tell people that I still have the counties of Arkansas stuck in my head because we had to memorize the rhythm. Yeah, I think I can get through the middle of the alphabet. And I'm convinced it's taking up a lot of brain space that should be used for something else. But they did such a good job, I cannot believe that.
Is that Mr. Mack?
That was Mr. Mack, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I've never gotten to do that with anyone else before. That was kind of scary, but cool. So, after I lived in Arkansas and then Missouri, I went to grad school in Florida, and then I ended up moving back into this part of the world, to Kansas City. Kind of briefly, and I moved there in August in the middle of a heat wave, rented an apartment with no air conditioning because I thought the heat wave will end, and then 3 weeks later it was still over 100 and I was just dying in my apartment, and then it started to snow in the middle of October, you know. So one of those years of really freakish weather, kind of like this year. And so in the midst of this, I read a quotation in the newspaper that kind of spoke to this. The poem is called The Heartland, and it's where the title of the collection comes from, The Heartland. In the beginning was snow, fluffy and colored like cabbage, pale green leaves of light folded in toward the ground. We who were from nowhere changed zip codes often, moving into uncertain weather. The sameness of change never ceased to astound us. Blocks away, the American Ice Company's red bricks melted to white. It was possible to believe a whole city's snow came from inside. Sidewalks turned into tight ropes. The sky waited. We all had something we'd rather stayed buried. We all had something staked on the thaw. One morning, the mailbox backed up with forwards which overflowed down the steps. We'd been located by names that chapped our lips when we said them. Ice hung from the gutters of the art museum like sculptures. People paid to stay outside. Shovels made soft sweeps, brushes across the unalterable, as men poured salt to our doorstep, a great evaporated sea. The papers tallied up deaths, and reported freezing was variable. In Houston, people start dying when the temperature drops below 30, while in Anchorage, death starts at -5. We had become the midpoint of a mortal geography. To find cave tours here. So Jonathan's request, this is cave tours. When we were living in Fort Worth, my father was a journalist for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and he did feature articles about all different things, and one summer he did a feature story on all the caves in Texas, so we toured pretty much all the caves in Texas. And so that's where some of the imagery of this poem comes from. Cave tours. The underworld the bright brochures have shown declines our courtesy. The rare albino fish wait in the falls, and the blind salamanders, ignoring camera flashes, sulk in cracks. Even the bats, aloof as specks of mold on Adam's half-clean torso, wake no fears. High ground we know is less than promised, flawed as a poorly buttressed church whose steeple we've inhabited for years without angelic sightings. Perhaps the other angels move down here as well. It's best at least to know the holes our faith must skirt or be led into. Our Virgil says this single room could hold the Pentagon, pointing his flashlight beam at iron curtains hemmed with pleated stone. We've seen all this before with other names, these forms we grace with shadows. Each time the lights click on, the novices blush as though they truly wished their petty sins kept private, as though our sin were not that desperation for the timer's lights, to ring the limits of our nothingness. Centuries old, these stones are still alive. Someday, the guide explains, these two will meet. We long to touch them, glistening, infantile, like space in us, too deep inside to heal. But know our Midas touch is mortal here. The tarnish on our palms adds up to death. So I'd like to read a few newer poems I've been working on this year since the book came out, a little before that. And this first one is based off of, my grandfather died in World War II on an ammunition ship, and there's a poem about that in Mortal Geography, and I've been writing more recently about my grandmother's widowhood and things that were happening during the war. And in my process of researching some of this, I ran across a radio show called Command Performance. Have any of you heard of this? It's very popular during World War II, and the idea with it was that the soldiers could write in and request any sound that they wanted to hear on the radio, and it would be played for them. And so I thought this was really fantastic, and this catalog of sounds that were really heard was so interesting. I had to write this. Command Performance. The soldiers could ask for any sound, roosters in their Indiana hometowns crowing at dawn, an operetta, a jive show with pretty girls, flushed and live-wired to those notes, jitterbugging on an old wood floor, Joe Louis slugging match-smelling with his perfect fists, Dick Tracy in B-flat, the clanking wish of a jackpot on a nickel slot machine. Inside the radio's soft static, every dream served up, the distant sizzle and scorch of Lana Turner frying a steak, a torch sputtering above the tiki hut where lime and Coca-Cola and its censored rum lilted from the Andrews sisters' throats. Anything but the night raid calls, lifeboats, torpedoes, fire, Jack Benny, Count Basie, Ann Miller tap dancing fast and racy in military boots, Tess Trueheart still not married to Dick Tracy, Charles Lawton teaching perfect elocution to Donald Duck, laughter, Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, luck. One reason the subject of widowhood has been on my mind is that I'm working on a big project, which I hope is going to turn into my next manuscript, about Sarah Winchester, who was the Victorian widow of the Winchester rifle fortune. You all probably know Winchester rifles were known as the gun that won the West and were very popular, actually used a lot in the Civil War and then in the whole westward expansion. And when Sarah Winchester was in her early 40s, her husband, who was the son of the founder of the company, died of tuberculosis, and their infant daughter had died a few years before that, and Sarah was deeply grieving both of these deaths, and according to the standard legend about this, consulted a spiritualist psychic who told her that the ghosts of the people killed with Winchester rifles were angry with the family, and that she would also be killed unless she built a house eternally. She had to continuously build a structure. So she, do any of you know this story? Some of you? Yeah. I was seeing some nods. So she moved out to San Jose, California. She moved from New England to San Jose, California, bought what was at the time, I think, a 6-room farmhouse, and by the time she died, 38 years later, after this continual construction had been going on, the house covered 6 acres, and it's still there. It's often known as the Winchester Mystery House, and it's very popular with haunted house people, but nobody that I know of has really looked at kind of this as a metaphor for the manifest destiny and westward expansion, and also what it was like for her as a, newly widowed woman in the Victorian era with limited options. And there is a lot of different accounts of why she might have really kept building the house besides the story of the gifts. So anyway, I'm really fascinated with this story, so I'm going to read you a few poems from that series. This is called Sarah Winchester, the Blueprint. Because the prophecy said build, this room hinged the sky, a doorway, a sill, a step, a floor, a chimney with nothing to burn. The ghosts have brick dust on their clothes, gunpowder bones. All night the hammers christen wood, railings, spindles, joists, baseboards, cupboards in cupboards, frames, posts, hallways, the only way to life, this labyrinth, a window to a window, trapdoor, skylight, stairway, each small step eternally divided. The ghosts have sawdust in their hair, demolished wings, new sketches for forgiveness, ballroom, bedroom, cupola, carriage house, walls around every emptiness. This is called the door to nowhere, which is one of the famous things in the house because she kept building. There's all these architectural oddities like doors that open to sheer drop-offs or chimneys that don't go all the way up through the roof. And various things. This is the door to nowhere. Is from the inside locked and ordinary, so the little girl on the tour who keeps asking in each room if we're there yet has to be prodded by her mother. Look, the guide already cheerfully spieling off deaths and rumors and yards of antique wallpaper, Lincrusta imported, glass valued at $25,000, spider webs that held some significance for Mrs. Winchester, although no one knows what. Ariadne with her fleece of facts, we trail room to room. The little girl clearly disappointed, twisting glances back at the blank brown unfinished wood. For the first time, maybe fearing how boring nowhere might be, exactly like somewhere invented by adults, like the back of her closet that never opens to Narnia, although she sits on her shoes, scrunched in the dark and waits, hoping with her whole body even now her mother is wrong and there's another door coming, or maybe even this one, if she looks right at the exact second, because she doesn't care about bedrooms and staircases when outside is that darker than Space Mountain space where all of us would dissolve if we went, which we wouldn't, only her, because she's not afraid of wherever we won't let her go. This next poem, also in the Winchester series, is based off a quotation that I found by Harry Houdini, the magician, contortionist, who came out very strongly against spiritualism and the idea that the central tenet of spiritualism was that people could communicate directly with the dead through knocking and through mediums and these different things. And Houdini came out against this and said that it was bogus magic. And so he said the following, which became both the epigraph for the poem and I use as a repeating line. It's a villanelle, so it's repeating lines from this. The quote is, Mrs. Winchester was told by a spiritualist that the reason a person dies is because the person does not continue to build additions to the house in which she lives. The spirit rots in the house that doesn't grow. It was handy that he said that in iambic pentameter, so you could use that. The house that doesn't grow. The spirit rots in the house that doesn't grow, the rigid pole lamps yellowing the light inside familiar rooms where shadows fold the corners back around us, bodies close, teacups and reading braced against the night, the spirits in the house that doesn't grow. What difference could it make as we grow old to have a child, a dollhouse, blinking Christmas lights inside familiar rooms where shadows fold? Could we outgrow ourselves? Have we outgrown the passed down furniture, the wakened nights, that the spirit rots in the house that doesn't grow? Or is this house a story we've been told? Persephone sequestered from the living light inside familiar rooms where shadows fold. And still we welcome shelter from the cold, the narrow love seat and the reassuring light, nights in familiar rooms where shadows fold, dark leaves around the house that doesn't grow. I'll read one more from this series and then a few more from the book. I've been imagining different reasons why Sarah Winchester would have kept building the house, and I was also imagining and thinking about her taking the train across the country. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, and so at the time she went across in 1884, it was still fairly new to be able to cross the country in that way. And so this poem is based on that. There's one thing. Oh, one thing I wanted to say about this is I learned from Rebecca Solnit's wonderful book, River of Shadows, which deals a lot with Western expansion and other topics. I learned that apparently when the railroad came through, they had to synchronize the clocks in each town so that everyone would be in agreement about the times the train was coming through, but before then, clocks in different towns had not had a need to be synchronized. And so I was really interested by this idea that time itself, that humans' perception of time and the way they kept it was altered by the technology of the railroad. So there's a reference to that. This is called Transcontinental. Who wouldn't want to keep going, the rails new and nailed to the low horizon, limitless those days of moving west so fast the clocks had to be synchronized in every town, but time stayed on the platforms. People waved, cried, faded into steam and bellow as you slipped away into no time, no place, just desert rattling past inside the frame, the blank and blinking miles or the mountain sides, all juniper and pine and promontory where the last stake struck had made this possible. Past hitched a future like those cars, clacking and full of cargo you never wanted to arrive in rooms stock still as death. Who wouldn't want a house built like a train when trains were new enough to carry us past loss and expectation? Rails of floorboards stretching on, and through each different window, different sky. I thought Jonathan and I were just talking about both having lived in the Bay Area, where I've spent most of the past 10 years, so I thought I would read a very San Francisco-y poem. How many of you have been out to the Bay Area? The front row and into the second row. I spent a lot of time, I haven't had a car the whole time I've lived out there, which is very possible as long as you like riding public transportation. And so many entertaining things happen on public transportation that it's well worth riding for that reason alone. So this is called 4 Games Played While Riding the Bus, and it's all based on actual things observed or done while riding the bus. 1. The couple across the aisle is playing rock, paper, scissors. Over and over their hands touch, under and over, and rock is always beaten by paper's soft drapery, though rock's crushing of scissors has more military pomp, while scissors are always a cut above paper. The elegance of childhood rules defining nature. Amazing, I think, not that adults would play, but that the game has brought into the rush hour fray this tacit silence, each one deciding only as they move the shapes their own fists guard. With each smooth sleight of hand, they're turning, it's better like this, it's not, let's don't, let's do, my love, I know your tricks, you never will, into swift 1, 2, 3, each turn risking strength exposed as vulnerability. 2. Maybe Alzheimer's is angelic possession, the mind's repetitive wings beating sense for all it's worth. Goddamn talking bus, says the old man at each announcement. And doesn't everyone agree, really? Though our askance glances impress that calls for silence ought to come in silence. Please vacate front seats for seniors, goddamn talking bus, and the disabled. Each sing-song echo more mechanical, we raise embarrassed newspapers or drink from empty coffee cups. But after he climbs off and the voice goes on, no eating or drinking on Muni, someone says below their breath, oh, won't you just shut up? 3. The French-Algerian self-proclaimed genius painter in a scarf and burgundy fedora on the hottest October evening this San Francisco reasons, but I'm not wearing any socks or underwear. And he shows us by baring his ankles, adding 6 pieces, counting my shoes. After the quiet minute in which we each impromptu tally, one friend says 7, another 5, and I, blushing, 4, and just like that, fully dressed, lose. The evening is down to hairpins of light outside the bus windows, the plastic seats smooth as skin, and in the seconds that follow this shared revelation, we ride silently toward the dark, as though we have found a new, more serious art, not to paint the town, but to watch it hour by hour strip, each loss wagered on this companionship. 4. Near the back of the bus, a man sits down and deals 3 cards into his lap. 1, the king, is marked. He says, these 2 lose, the king card wins. These 2 lose, the king card wins. Not these, the red card. If you got money and you got heart, you can win yourself some money now. With shuffling sleight of hand, he turns them up, but no one will play him. The king is bent. These 2 lose, the king card's high. If you got 20 and you got heart, will no one play because the game is rigged to favor us? Because we pity him, his fumbling fast hands as they lay the bent card down? Or do we fear the con that surely waits? No matter the cards, we know these blues. If you got money and you got heart, you can always lose. Close with 2 more poems. One is another grammar poem, which came out of teaching a grammar class at City College and having this wonderful student from Korea named Hee-sun, who was so interested. She just really found the grammar of English beautiful. She didn't want to just be able to technically use it correctly. She was fascinated by the structure of the language itself. And one day she came to class and she had copied out Bible verses, and she was diagramming them and marking what kinds of phrases and clauses each part was. And she asked me about them, and I thought this was really beautiful. And tried for a long time to write about it and finally came out with this. English fundamentals. To practice her grammar, Hee-sun is diagramming the Bible's most beautiful sentences. She brings me, consider the lilies of the field in small, neat script. She does not say if she believes the Gospels, just the language is so pretty, shyly asking if the subject is implied. Are lilies and field, drawn inside green rectangles, different kinds of objects? Each day for months I've watched her arrange the morning colors from her narrow case of pens, laying them like scalpels for the body of her new language. She loves inverted subjects and elliptical clauses, rare cases that reveal new, more subtle workings. But now as I see each word made radiant, consider, grow, toil, and spin underlined in purple, and yet I say to you, circled in red, I see the colors are tools of a more ancient reverence. She has handed me grammar as a stained glass window, each piece cut and soldered into syntax. Even Solomon, proper noun, blue as a subject, in all his glory, hot pink prepositional phrase, was not arrayed like one of these. One last poem, inspired by living in Florida and the time after that. It's called Hurricane Season. I heard on the news this morning that there was a chance of tornadoes here today. I was also told by two people that it was snowing across all of Oklahoma as I was flying in yesterday. I was told, but apparently they're saying this on the weather forecasts in California and Idaho. Both places they said, your plane was able to land, it's snowing all over. And then when we got the guy who was driving us to the airport, I said, what's going on with the snow? It doesn't land. He was like, there's no snow coming, it's 60 degrees. Keep waiting for your extreme weather. I was in Florida during, well, a hurricane was supposed to hit. We got evacuated from the beach, so here's reference. Hurricane season. When I become accustomed at last to lying in bed alone, sheets finely wrinkled as curtains blown across the windows of dreams, and the crane-necked streetlight fills the room with its electric-nerved, luminous vision. What I had seen for my future, the restless flowering of his arms in sleep around my shoulder, the soiled pillows in their matching cases where our faces, breaths apart, turned toward and away, recedes like the hurricane that never hit land the night we met, when the beach was evacuated, the building shuttered in plywood, and the news crews stood dry amid the whipping palms in the margins of their own story. Later we saw a photograph shot high in the clouds, the storm's eye turning above the ocean, as we swam at midnight in the pool naked, waiting to be swept up in a chlorine shudder, a geyser of winds, into the rapture of our lives. And though we almost bought it together, we didn't. Somewhere, framed in its calm bay of glass, that storm is hanging on the gallery's wall at the pinpoint end of this land, or in a room like the one where even now he is lying beside her, sleep's aperture narrowing around them, and all the years when we almost loved each other forever, at last, blown far off the shore of this life. Thank you.
Q&A?
Question and answer?
Yeah.
I love answering questions. I love attempting to answer questions. Ask me things.
All right, I'll lead.
Okay.
You mentioned Sistina. You mentioned other classical poetic forms. Having not gone through the whole book yet and trying to identify what other forms have you written in, but more to the cut to the chase. Why the classical forms, and what draws you to them? And I guess that's the question. What draws you to the classical forms? What do they do for you as a contemporary poet?
Well, it's really interesting because I didn't know anything about form when I went to grad school, and William Logan, who I studied with there, forced us to write in form, and I enjoyed it at the time. I was interested by it, but it wasn't necessarily a thing I thought I would keep returning to. And then over the years after that, I just kept kind of challenging myself to say, well, what would happen if I tried to write a Sestina? And I think, to start with, I think I saw it as this huge challenge. I mean, it is still a huge challenge. But then I started realizing that the forms are such a wonderful way of helping to shape and refine the language and get me to think about things in ways that I wouldn't have otherwise because of the requirements of the form. I end up with things that are, and I think that's true of any kind of restriction that you put on a poem, whether, I mean, sometimes I'll just kind of somewhat arbitrarily say to myself, well, the first few lines are approximately this length, I'm going to make all the other lines very similar length, and that's just that condensing that occurs because you've asked yourself to not, sprawl out and say things in, any of the many, I mean, that's one of the challenges of poetry, right? You could say things in any possible way, and having some kinds of restrictions on that can actually make you more creative and go places you wouldn't anticipate. So I think that's really been an important part of my writing. And I'm interested in the relationship between the form and content, of course. In the Winchester poems, I'm working with repeating forms because of the repetitive, continual building. I'm interested in that idea, but I'm also interested in kind of inventing forms that mirror the things that I'm trying to write about. So to see how form can kind of enact content.
Talk a little bit about some of those as they're growing.
Yeah. I've been, I've been writing a whole series, including a crown of sonnets that are Winchester sonnets, which are 13 lines long because Sarah Winchester was obsessed with the number 13, so everything throughout the house is 13, 13 candlesticks or 13 prisms on the chandelier or whatever, it's all in 13 windows in a room. So actually a friend of mine had the brilliant idea. I had written a 12-line, but actually the blueprint, the one I read, is a Winchester sonnet, and he had the brilliant idea. It was originally 12 lines, and he said, you need to add one line and turn this into a 13-line sonnet in honor of her. So I've been playing with that. That's a simple example, but I've got another poem that uses all of the same end words in the first section in reverse order in the second section, so it kind of undoes itself, and it's a poem about her husband's death, and so I'm wanting to play with the idea of sort of like building towards the death and then the undoing, so things like that. I know a lot of that arises kind of organically out of the subject matter, but then I see what happens if I keep pushing the subject matter in the direction of fitting that form.
How's the reception been when you send these poems off to journals? And would you find that there's a cultural space or polemic that either inhibits submitting classical forms to journals, or whether they've been welcomed, and what maybe you would have to just speculate on what the reception of invented forms might be like, but something like that. I mean, it's not a normal thing to do.
Right.
So how's it been?
It's interesting. Well, historically, Measures, the Sestina I read was never published anywhere. I sent it out for years, and it never was published until in the book. In more recent years, like the bus poems that I read as a sequence of sonnets, and that got picked up, and some other invented forms that are in this book did get picked up. So I feel like maybe as I've gotten, I'm not terribly established, but as I've gotten a little bit more name recognition, I think that people are more likely to look at these. And it's been really interesting for me, though, because I did not think of myself as a formalist when Mortal Geography came out. I still don't really think of myself as a formalist, but a lot of the reception of this book has been responding to its formal playfulness and, making reference to me. I mean, one of the blurbs on the back calls me a formalist, and so it's been interesting, and I think that's kind of shaped my desire to do more with it in the Winchester Project and see, well, how can I push that and where will it go? So I think that there are certainly journals that are willing to pick up those pieces, but there are others that, particularly I think Sestinas are one of those forms that nobody wants to publish because they're too repetitive. I'm not quite sure what the deal is. Villanelles get published a lot. Crowns of sonnets get published. Sestinas not so much.
Yeah.
Or they're looked at like as a grad student exercise or something.
So to know that you have received this school retroactively once you've already finished your book.
Yes.
Or thought of yourself as formalist.
Yes.
That's quite interesting.
Yes.
But it doesn't surprise me, because it does seem like it's something that usually one chooses to enter into that kind of debate around form.
Right.
Alexi Sherman would be another person who maybe isn't a formalist, but
right.
in the context of free verse, yeah, he is.
Right.
So,
yeah, exactly. Well, I think it's interesting. I think that during the years that I was writing and actually not showing my work to a lot of people after grad school, and I was playing around with these forms, I think I thought at some level that everybody just sometimes liked to play around with Villanelles or Sestinas and see what they could do with it. I mean, in my mind, it seemed like a very natural thing, and I think partly I do have the kind of mind that really likes sort of puzzle-like challenges and seeing how the pieces can fit together and how I can work with those kinds of restrictions, so that was very appealing to me, so I kept doing it for that reason, not thinking so much about although I have read things, particularly about women writers who talk about reinventing form and taking control of classical, traditionally male forms and how they can do that, and I'm sure that influenced me. I read some of those things years ago before grad school.
It seems like this new work too almost seems procedural, right? And leaning into the avant-garde traditions, where you're setting up these arbitrary rules that you have to produce work from.
Right.
That'll be interesting as a, you know, for people who might anticipate more traditional forms to encounter
Right.
work. We'll have to read the blurbs in the next one and see.
Yeah,
how it
exactly. And
goes.
then I'll find out what I am and who I am then, right? I'm waiting for the blurbs like, oh wait, okay. What else?
What is it about Sarah Winchester's story that really resonated with you? Why was it her that you chose to, you know, take on this project about?
That's a great question. I had gone to the Winchester house maybe about 7 years ago, and I thought it was really interesting, but I didn't know that I was going to become obsessed with this. And then maybe about 3 years ago, I started thinking more about the house and thinking about her story and just wanting to do a little bit of research. And then it's really, I guess I was interested from the beginning about this legend, and I'm interested in legends and stories and how they shape our behavior. And I'm interested in the idea of hauntings and communication with the dead, that sort of thing. I was raised originally in a big Texas farmhouse that was supposed to be haunted, so I probably have personal reasons, you know, that. And then growing up in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, which has many haunted places, lots of ghosts, you know, so that's something that's always interested me. So I guess I was already interested in that, and then as I started to do a little bit more research over the past few years, I found so much in her story that was really, I got more interested in her as a person, and this idea, like I said, of her being a Victorian widow and with a lot of money. I mean, by that time standards, you know, she's this millionaire, but she's lost the two people who she loves most in the world and didn't really have a lot of options. I mean, a widow with that kind of money, and it wasn't like she was going to go to work somewhere, or, you know, what was she going to do? And one of the things that some of her friends said is that she just was very interested in architecture, and that she, in fact, was not trying to appease ghosts or scare off ghosts or anything like that. She was just had a lot of money, and she was interested in architecture, and so she would draw up blueprints for things, and she would have people build them, and she didn't really know what she was doing, and so the house turned out all crazy, but this was a way to occupy herself. And apparently she was also a very smart businesswoman, and she did have orchards on the land and produce from that and everything. So I'm interested in how she was seen within the Victorian society, how she was seen in San Jose as the house grew. She kind of became ostracized for the rest of society. They thought this was this very freakish thing, and so I'm interested in thinking, well, what was it like for her to live in this vast house? Whether or not she honestly believed the ghosts of all the people with Winchester rifles were there, she was definitely very haunted by the loss of these people she loved. So it's a lot. And I lost my mother when I was 27, and she had lost her father when she was 12, and so I've also, you know, raised in a family where there are these, you know, I mean, every family has losses, but definitely with these, you know, family ghosts very present. So there's a lot. I could go on and on and on. And I will in the book.
Does that mean I can't ask you a question?
No, you can. No, you can. Please. No,
you know, when you first started, I'm doing this book project, when you started talking about it, it actually sounded like you might be doing something in prose, a kind of research project.
Oh, yeah.
You know, because it was you know, ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you know, as I suspected, they were poems. So here's the question is, when you take on essentially a research project, but the result of which are poems that you make, it seems like it's a very different relationship to your research topic than most people in all walks of life would be engaged in. Much more personal, and so on. So is there, do you think that this project is going to incubate a poetics of, you know, of haunting? Do you draw on, you know, like, it seems like there's going to be over sustained research. Is this going to be a whole book?
I'm hoping it's going to be a whole book.
That seems quite unique. So the question is a very loose one. What do you think it has? What has it been like so far? Are you haunted by the fusion, you know, this deep engagement, which isn't a descriptive engagement, but is an interactivity, you know, a co-creation? You are cohabitating these empty rooms with her, you know, and building on to the structure, because from now on this will be part of an intertextual extension of what otherwise is a stopped project.
Right.
So you're building new empty rooms and so on.
Yes. Yes, I'm very much wrestling with and aware of a lot of those levels and have been moving through them. I mean, I wrote Mortal Geography over the course of about 14 years, the oldest poems I wrote when I was in undergraduate, and then things in graduate school and all these other years, and I wasn't really thinking about shaping them into a book or how they would go together. I was just writing individual poems, and they eventually became this thing. And so this has been interesting to take on a project more consciously and have some ideas some more kind of theoretical ideas of what I think the poems are doing in relation to the house and the history and all of that, but then to figure out how to move from those kind of theoretical ideas. I mean, Mallarmé said that poetry is not made out of ideas, it's made out of words, right? So I think like it's important that for me, that I've got to move beyond the ideas of what I think I'm doing with this in the abstract and into the actual words and into enough emotional resonance and kind of lived experience that allows me to enter her story. And so that's been definitely a challenge. I mean, Mortal Geography is much more personal, or stories that I overheard, versus this material that I really am trying to figure out how I inhabit it and yeah, what the role of these poems is in relation to the house. It's interesting, of course, a friend said, you'll never be able to stop writing the poems, right? Or you will die. So there is kind of also that fear, like what does it mean to take on somebody who was obsessive and haunted, like to take on their story and their personality and write in their voice and everything. We'll see. I've written about 15 poems towards the project so far, and I feel as though there are, we'll probably have to write many more than a volume's worth to kind of figure out how the pieces fit and how it comes together.
I would love to see a floor plan.
Of the house?
Oh, I thought you meant the book.
I've read, yeah, that. Well, I've read in some sources that they've never fully mapped it. Other things say that there are 160 rooms and that they have mapped it, but I've read some places that they aren't really positive they've mapped the whole thing because there are rooms that got shut off during the 1906 earthquake and other things, and rooms that were always kept locked for some reason, and so yeah, it's a really fascinating space. I haven't seen just that. That would be interesting. But yeah.
You'll have to just kind of another question on form, but talked about having a mother piano teacher. Like I've played piano most of my life. I was those 30-minute lessons. But has the form of music ever been played with in your poetry? Kind of. I've also been reading Frost, just talking about like the sound of poetry and how that was music influenced that. So.
Yeah, I think I've been really influenced by music, but I don't play. I've never become proficient at anything musically. I think of myself as a very non-musical person, but I think that my interest in music does come out in my poetry, and I'm sure that growing up around piano lessons and in a decently musical household has influenced me. My partner, who's here in the front row, is a musician. I definitely, gravitate towards musical conversations and things. So I think, and I write very much by ear. And whether I'm writing in meter or just paying attention to the rhythms of it, which is what I do more of the time, I can hear whether or not something belongs. And I often, I don't go back and scan my own work most of the time, so I don't know. I mean, somebody could probably more scientifically say, well, this is the reason why you heard that this sounds like it fits here, but I just hear that that's what belongs next, and then I, if I read it aloud to myself, which I often do, then I have to, go back and change if it doesn't sound right. So there's a level at which the musicality of the language is extremely important to me, and I'm interested. I've just been doing some work with Mark Doty's poetry, and he's got the fantastic poem "Almost Blue" about Chet Baker, the trumpet player, and I really think that poem enacts a sense of Baker's trumpet playing through through its rhythms and through the way the syntax is working in relation to the lines, and so I'm really interested in that idea too, how music can be enacted through poetry.
He's also a great singer too, by the way. Crazy voice.
Just kidding.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Other questions? These are such good, interesting questions.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much.